What's fascinating is that the majority of the Kinot, which we recite on the morning of Tisha B'Av, have nothing to do with the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. The overwhelming majority of the Kinot, which we customarily recite, these lamentations that were written across the centuries, don't deal with the destruction of the Holy Temple or Jerusalem. Yes, they may have hints or allusions to the destruction of the Temple. They may have comparisons. They may compare a specific tragedy that took place with the destruction of the Holy Temple. But if you take a look, you have Kinot that are written about different pogroms and persecutions that take place in Germany, the burning of the Talmud in 1242 in Paris, France, a famous Kinot written by the Maharam Mirottenberg, for example. You have Kinot about the Crusades. We'll look in a moment at a Kinot that was written about the First Crusade of 1096, which destroyed the Jewish communities of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. And then, of course, you have contemporary Kinot, and that's our subject this morning. Following the Holocaust, the devastation and destruction, the Churban in Europe, you have tens of Kinot written about the Holocaust. Many of them appear, or some of them appear, in the various collected Kinot. Different communities have different customs, which ones they say. And then more recently, even a handful of Kinot written following the Hitnatkut, the disengagement, or as some call it, the Gerush, the expulsion from Gush Katif, from Gaza. Okay? And our question this morning is why? Why do so many of the Kinot, as I said, the overwhelming majority of the Kinot that we recite Tisha B'Av morning, sitting on the ground, why are they about other things? Why don't they focus on the matter at hand, so to speak, the tragedy of the destruction of the Holy Temple? Why are there so many Kinot about other things, other tragedies and calamities that took place at different points throughout Jewish history? They really span the entire course of Jewish history if you take a look at the Kinot that we recite. Why? Why? And what role does that play? And what about these contemporary Kinot? I mean, do we have the authority to author new Kinot and introduce new Kinot into the liturgy? I mean, are we allowed to do that? And why do we want to do that, if it is permitted? Okay? So, one reason, and there are a number, I think, but one reason why the focus on Tisha B'Av morning is not limited to the destruction of the Holy Temple and Jerusalem, but is much broader in scope. One reason is because, as we know, so many different tragedies and calamities took place on Tisha B'Av itself. Tisha B'Av itself is born under a bad sign, if you will, to borrow from the Talmud, which says that Av has a bad mazel, okay? So if Av has a bad mazel, it's bad luck for the Jews, and Tisha B'Av is born under a bad sign. And we know throughout Jewish history, so many tragedies and calamities took place on Tisha B'Av itself. And so we'll begin with a very powerful passage from the commentary of the Abravanel, who lived in Spain in the 15th century, to Yirmiyahu Perek Bet, the second chapter of Jeremiah. And this is on a pasuk in Yirmiyahu Perek Bet, pasuk Chav Daled, verse 24, where the Navi describes that Kol mevaksheha lo yi'afu, all who pursue her, all who are chasing after her, all who pursue her, lo yi'afu, they will not tire. They will not tire out, become weary. Bechodsha yimtzaunha. Oh, bechodsha yimtzaunha. In her month, they will find her. Or in her time, they will find her. Well, what chodesh are we talking about? What time is this? And for the Abravanel, it's obvious. It's talking about Chodesh Av. Okay, this is a very, very powerful passage. And take a look where I've underlined here in source number 2. So the Abravanel in his comments there says, "V'hazman hamuchan letzarotav hu hachodesh hakavua lera'oto chodesh av ve'alav amar bechodsha yimtzaunha." The time that is set aside for pain, for tragedy, is this established month for bad, and that is the month of Av. And that is what the verse is alluding to when it says that her pursuers will not tire out, they will find her in her month. What month is that? It's the month of Av. Halo tireh, sheboto achodesh digzera gzera al dor hamidbar, shesham yemutu. Right? Don't we find, he writes, that it was on that day that the decree was made against the generation of the Midbar? He's, of course, referring to how when the spies came back with their report, it was on Tisha B'Av, and the Jewish people, they wept and they cried. And the Gemara in Masechet Ta'anit explains that just like they cried for nothing, a Bechia Shel Chinam, Hashem established this day as a Bechia L'Dorot, a day of crying for all future generations. Okay? And it's not just that, but the Mishnah at the end of Masechet Ta'anit explains that there were 5 tragedies that took place on Tisha B'Av. Right? It's when the spies returned with their report about the land and the Jewish people cried, again establishing this day as a day of weeping for future generations. It's when the first and second temples were destroyed. It's when the city of Beitar, which was a stronghold, if you will, for the supporters of Bar Kokhba during the Bar Kokhba revolt against the Romans, which took place some 60 plus years after the temple had been destroyed, from the years 132 to 135 of the Common Era. And in the beginning, they were very successful, but then the Romans sent in their legions and completely crushed the rebellion. And they destroyed the city of Beitar, and they made an example out of these rebels. And the Mishnah also says that the city of Jerusalem was plowed under, Nechresha Ha'ir. The Temple Mount was plowed under. The city of Jerusalem was plowed under by the Romans, turning it into a pagan city, Aelia Capitolina, forbidding Jews from living there, from going there. Okay? And so the Mishnah says there were 5 things, but the Abravanel continues and says, in fact, there were many more than just 5 things that happened on this day, which in the language of the Rambam is a day that's Muchan Lepuranut. The Rambam refers to Tisha B'Av as a day that's set aside, Muchan Lepuranut, set aside for tragedy. In the book of Eicha, it's called a Mo'ed, an established time for punishment. And so the Abravanel continues that Vilel Tisha B'Av Haya, when they returned, and Bo Bayom Necharav Bayit Rishon Bo, Biyom Necharav, Bo Bayom Necharav Bayit Sheni, right? On the day of Tisha B'Av, that's when the first and second temples were destroyed. Now it's interesting. The Gemara asks, well, how do we know that the first temple was destroyed on the 9th of Av? And the Gemara brings a verse to support that. But then the Gemara asks, how do we know that the second temple was also destroyed on the 9th of Av? I mean, it's kind of ironic, right? That the second temple would be destroyed on the very same day? Is that just a coincidence? And the Talmud says that it's a Yom Chayav, meaning it couldn't have happened on any other day. That there are days that are good days and there are days that are set aside for punishment and bad days. And Hashem made it happen that the second temple would be destroyed on the 9th of Av, the same day that the first temple was destroyed, because it's a Yom Chav. And basically, it could not have happened on any other day. It wouldn't be possible for the temple to be destroyed on any other day. This is the day that is designated, again, in the language of the Rambam, for Puranut. Okay? Bo Bayom Necharav Alexandria Kal Gadol Miyudim. And on the 9th of Av, the Jewish community in Alexandria was destroyed. Kal Gadol Miyudim Sheya Shama. A very large community. The Gemara in Masechet Sukkah describes just how large the community was and how large their synagogue was. They had to wave banners, flags, to let people know when to answer Amen. They couldn't hear the Shaliach Tzibur, they couldn't hear the Chazan, because the synagogue was so large. And the Gemara describes whoever whoever never saw the synagogue and the Jewish community in Alexandria never saw grandeur, and just describes the structure and the edifice, how large the synagogue was. So this was a major Jewish community in Alexandria, Egypt, which was also destroyed on Tisha B'Av. Bo bayom na'asa girush iktzeh haaretz hanikra Anglia tira. And not just that, but the Abravanel continues. Now we're getting into more recent history, more recent Jewish history, that it was on Tisha B'Av when the Jews were expelled from England. That's this island at the end of the world. For someone living in continental Europe, England is this island at the end of the world. Ubo bayom na'asa girush tzarfat bishnat kale garesh gigarash etchem mizeh. It's a play on words, but on that very day, the Jews of France were expelled from France. The Kaftor Vaferach, Ishtori Aparchi, we've spoken about in the past, cites this, that it happened on Tisha B'Av. V'kama od me'ashmadot v'gerushim hayu b'chodesh hahu liYisrael. And how many, he says, more expulsions and persecutions and terrible things and tragedies and calamities have happened to the Jewish people in this month. In this month, which is alluded to in this verse in Yirmiyahu Perek Bet. And then he says, Umau sif od ledavar. And what could we add? Hine, v'hine kishegazar melech Sfarad girush al kol hayudim asher b'chol medinot malchuto, shetz'u ki mishlosh chodashim nishlam v'haya yom hayitzia tet b'av. He says, what could we add? Now he's referring to his own day. He's referring to what he's living through. What can we say? What can we add? The king of Spain had announced that the Jews must leave, and they're given 3 months. And the very last day for them to leave was August 1st, 1492, and that night was Tisha B'Av. Okay, now scholars will discuss and debate, maybe they had to leave previously. This was like an extension. This was like the very last day. And the Abravanel continues, this is not just a coincidence, right? He says, it's not that the king of Spain knew and understood the significance of the 9th of Av and therefore planned the expulsion from Spain to take place on the 9th of Av, and the very last day on which the Jews had to leave would be the 9th of Av. It's not that he did that intentionally. He didn't know, right? He says, "Davar ki'ilu min hashamayim idrichu." It's as if he was directed from heaven. As if he was directed from heaven that the last possible day would be Tisha B'Av in order to fulfill the words of the prophet. The prophet Yirmiyahu said, in her month, they will find her. At this time, they will find her. And of course, we can add to the words of the Abravanel, because we know that more recently, for example, the First World War broke out on Tisha B'Av. That's when World War I began. And certain decisions with regards to World War II and the implementation of the final solution, certain seminal meetings and significant decisions were made on Tisha B'Av. And certain deportations, major deportations, for instance, from the Warsaw Ghetto, took place on the 9th of Av. And other events, and more recently, the state of Israel had initially planned that the disengagement from Gaza was going to take place on the 9th of Av. They didn't look at the Hebrew calendar or the Jewish calendar, and they just picked a date. And I mean, how ironic or tragic, or I'm searching for the right word, would it have been had it been on Tisha B'Av? Until eventually someone probably told them, hey, this is not a good day. It's too evocative. It evokes too many things. It's a tragic day for the Jewish people. We don't want to add another tragedy. Okay? So they changed the date. But of course, that's very significant. So historically, there were many, many tragedies and calamities that took place on Tisha B'Av itself. But the truth is, even if it wouldn't fall on Tisha B'Av. And again, scholars and historians may discuss and debate the historicity or accuracy of some of these dates. Was it exactly on Tisha B'Av? Was it a little before, a little after? The truth is, it doesn't really matter. Because as we'll see in a few moments, Tisha B'Av is the day that is set aside for mourning all of our national tragedies and calamities throughout Jewish history, whether or not they took place on Tisha B'Av, whether or not they took place in the month of Av, whether or not they took place even close to Av. They could have taken place, in Adar, right? They could take place in Nisan, okay? In Iyar, it doesn't matter. Tisha B'Av is the day that we sit on the floor and cry and mourn all of our national tragedies and calamities throughout Jewish history. Because our pain transcends a specific date. Our pain is not limited to the 9th of Av itself, but the 9th of Av is the day that's designated to mourn and to cry and to express grief and to cry out to Hashem. So that brings us to, here's source number 3. This is just a little excerpt from a Kinot that is said in many, if not most, if not all, communities on Tisha B'Av morning. A very famous Kinot, Mi Yitain Roshimayim, which was composed by Rabbi Kalonimus ben Yehuda of Speyer. And this Kinot is about the destruction of what's known as Kilat Shum, or Kilot Shum, the tripartite community of Shum, which stands for Speyer, Vermeisa, and Mainz. Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, which were really destroyed during the first Crusades of 1096. And he discusses this in this Kinot. And he says something there which has tremendous significance for our discussion this morning. He writes the following, here in source number 3. V'chi ein lahosif moed shever v'taveira. He says, we cannot add. It's not proper to add a day of breach and taveira, fire, conflagration. Okay, that's a fancy word. Destruction. We cannot add a day of destruction, of mourning, if you will. Ve'en lahakdim zulati la'achara. And we can't advance it, rather we postpone it. So the way many understand this passage is the Baal Kinot here is saying we can't add another day of mourning to the Jewish calendar. We have Tisha B'Av, and even though we have this tremendous tragedy which took place here during the period of Sfirat HaOmer, it took place in Iyar and Sivan, and that's why, by the way, we recite the Av HaRachamim even on Shabbatot when we normally would not, between Pesach and Shavuot, because that's when the first Crusades took place, and that prayer, Av HaRachamim, was composed for the martyrs that died during the first Crusades. So really, the way many understand this, what he's saying is really we should maybe create a new day of mourning, right, to commemorate this tragedy, the destruction of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, except we cannot do so. We can't add another day of mourning. That's how many understand this verse, this passage here. And Tisha B'Av, we can't, Ein Lahakdim, we can't advance it, rather we postpone it, right? The Gemara teaches that when it comes to Puranut, when it comes to tragedy, right, we don't advance, we postpone. Whereas with the reading the Megillah, right, we might advance it. But with Tisha B'Av, as we do this year, with Shiva Sabbat Tammuz as we did, and as we will do with Tisha B'Av, as they fall on Shabbat this year, we don't fast on the preceding Friday or Thursday. We postpone it. We push it off to Sunday. Okay. Tachat ken hayom livyati ha'orera ve'espeda ve'elilah ve'efke b'nefesh mara va'anchati kavda miboker ad arev. He continues that, therefore, today I'm going to arouse my grief and lament and wail and cry with a bitter soul and sigh with heaviness from dawn to dusk, from morning to evening. Okay? So again, the way many understand this passage is it's not permitted to add a new day of mourning. And of course, this passage becomes significant. This is something that we've spoken about in the past with the establishment of Yom HaShoah here in the state of Israel. Even before the establishment of Yom HaShoah, and this is something that we've spoken about in the past, Rav Herzog, once he started to receive reports of what was going on in Europe and the devastation, the destruction there, and the murder of so many Jews, Rav Herzog, then chief rabbi, this of course is pre-state, wanted to establish a series of days of fasting and mourning and prayer. And so he enlisted the help of some leading poskim at the time. Among them, someone a recent arrival to Israel, the Brisker Rav Yitzchak Zev Soloveitchik, son of Rav Chaim, the great Griz, we call him, the Griz, Rav Velvel, affectionately known as Rav Velvel. And he asked Rav Velvel for his support in establishing days of fasting and mourning for what was taking place in real time. And Rav Velvel was opposed to establishing any new day of mourning or fasting on the Jewish calendar because he believed Tisha B'Av is the sole day in which we fast and mourn Jewish tragedies and calamities. And he cited this Kinot as a proof. Mi'itein Roshi Mayim, this Kinot of Rabbi Kalonimus ben Yehuda of Speyer. Ein lahosif moed shever v'tavera, we have no authority to add. And it wasn't just the Brisker Rav, but other rabbis as well. Rav Moshe Feinstein later would write a tshuva following the establishment of Yom HaShoah, where he felt that it was inappropriate to establish a new day of mourning. Rather, the Shoah should be mourned on Tisha B'Av. That is how Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, now I'm referring to the Rav, the nephew of the Griz, the nephew of Rav Velvel, he also felt it's not appropriate, again, citing this Kinot. Okay? In fact, supposedly when Rav Soloveitchik, I'm talking about the Rav now, it was a leader of Orthodoxy in America in the 20th century, and at the helm of Yeshiva University, where I studied. He led Yeshiva University for many years and a spokesperson for Orthodoxy in America. When he met with Menachem Begin, supposedly they discussed perhaps moving Yom HaShoah to Tisha B'Av, as was initially discussed in the early days of statehood. I mentioned Rav Herzog faced great opposition even pre-state when he wanted to establish days of fasting and mourning for what was taking place in real time then, but following the establishment of the State of Israel, when they were trying to create a day to memorialize what took place and when it should be, and it should be connected with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and should the tone and tenor be about gevura and might and strength, or should it be about mourning? But a major machloket among the rabbis, maybe we should not establish Yom HaShoah whatsoever, because Tisha B'Av is the day to mourn the Shoah. Okay, so this passage was very, very important in that discussion and debate. And this passage also becomes important when discussing adding new Kinot. Because following the Shoah, you have this whole genre of Holocaust Kinot. And you've got tens of Holocaust Kinot that were composed. And there were leading rabbis and poskim, like the Griz, Rav Velvel Soloveitchik, and his nephew, the Rav, who were very against it. And they cited this passage. They said, we have no authority to add new days of mourning to the Jewish calendar. Tisha B'Av is the day that we mourn all calamities and tragedies throughout Jewish history, but also we have no authority to add new Kinot. So what they were saying in essence is we should mourn the Holocaust on Tisha B'Av, but we should mourn the Holocaust with the established liturgy, with the Kinot which we already have. We should not add new Kinot. We should somehow find meaning, right? We should mourn the Holocaust and find meaning in the book of Kinot which we already have. And again, they drew on this passage from this Kinot of Rabbi Kalonimus ben Yehuda of Speyer, but they also cited precedent and said, and in fact, we have other examples of devastating devastating tragedies throughout Jewish history, and we do not find that they added new Kinot. The Haraya, Gzeirot Tach Vitat, the Khmelnytsky massacres of 1648 to 1649, which devastated Polish Jewry, and we don't find that they wrote Kinot for the Khmelnytsky massacre. Okay, and that was a devastating blow for Polish Jewry. Now, the truth of the matter is, this argument is problematic because we do find that there were Jewish communities who established fasts, as Rav Herzog points out in the Tshuva, and days of mourning for massacres, including the Khmelnytsky massacre. Well, they did it on the same day when the Talmud was burnt and whatever. But in any case, or the 20th of Sivan, there were certain days. There is a precedent of establishing a new day of mourning. Now, some will argue, like Rav Moshe Feinstein and others, that, well, yes, but those were limited to, let's say, regional days of mourning and fasting. They were not imposed on all of Klal Yisrael, and we do not have the authority to impose a new day of mourning and fasting on all of Klal Yisrael, and that's what this piyut is saying. Okay? But Rav Herzog in the Tshuva says, what do you mean? There's a precedent of establishing new days of mourning and fasting, and pointed to different communities, and again, Rav Moshe and others would say, well, those were only regional days of mourning and fasting. Okay? But you also have a precedent, maybe not of new Kinot for the Khmelnytsky massacre, but they composed slichot, which are like Kinot, but slichot to be said on the days when they would fast for what happened in 1648 and 1649. So, in any case, there is somewhat of a precedent, and in addition, we also find that there was a minhag in Ashkenaz, in medieval Ashkenaz, for individuals to compose their own Kinot. For individuals to compose their own Kinot about the Churban HaBayit. You have sources which discuss, some attributed to the Maharami Rotenberg and others, other great Chachmei Ashkenaz, that say that on Tisha B'Av morning you'd go to the synagogue, and after the tefillot, everyone would recite Kinot that they composed from their heart. And an individual who is unable to compose a kinah, either because he's not learned, or because maybe he doesn't have that poetic flair, he doesn't have the pen of a poet, right? Not everyone's a poet. So they can recite the established Kinot that we traditionally recite. But you see, there is a precedent for composing new Kinot. And after all, I mentioned that there were Kinot that were composed throughout the centuries. Whether it's for the first Crusades in 1096, like we just saw, whether it's the Maharami Rotenberg writing a Kinah following the burning of the Talmud in 1242, which he witnessed with his own eyes, okay, following the disputations there in France. However, Rav Soloveitchik explained the following. And I'm reading now from a very, very beautiful book. It really, really makes Tisha B'Av all the more meaningful. It's called The Lord is Righteous in All His Ways, Reflections on the Tisha B'Av Kinot. It's a book that was published by the Toras Harav Foundation and Ktav. And it records these beautiful shiurim that Rav Soloveitchik would give on Tisha B'Av morning, and the explanations of the Kinot that he would give. He would give these very long shiurim, and really all day he would sit on the ground and speak about, until mincha, he would speak about the Kinot and speak about all different things throughout Jewish history, and just gave very, very fascinating and lengthy shiurim. And this was collected and edited by Rabbi J.J. Schachter. Okay, very, very beautiful, beautiful sefer. And although, like I said last week, hopefully we'll be able to put it in Geniza. We won't have a need for it, right? I mentioned last week that there used to be this minhag to print the Kinot, Eicha and the Kinot, on very, very thin paper, and each year to put it away, put it in Geniza, with the hope and prayer that next year we won't have to use it. And now here we have all these beautiful hardcover fancy svarim. But he writes the following. This is, I'm reading from page 298 to 299. On Tisha B'Av, our eulogy is not limited to the 10 martyrs They were the first victims. We also deliver a eulogy for the victims of the Crusades and for the deaths of millions of Jews down through Jewish history, including those killed by Hitler. I would rather use a piyut by one of the Balei HaTosafot or any other of the Chachmei Ashkenaz than a liturgical piece by a present-day writer. And here he's going to relate to this genre of Kinot that begins after the Holocaust with tens of Holocaust Kinot. In fact, an imitation of a Kinah was written for those killed by Hitler in the 1940s, and not badly written. Some rabbis in Eretz Yisrael accepted it, but I do not like it. I do not like new prayers. I cannot use it because, in my opinion, there is no one, no contemporary who has all the qualities indispensable for writing prayers. I am always reluctant to accept new compositions in general. I do not trust anyone who tells me he intends to compose a prayer. I do not believe in so-called liturgical creativity or creative liturgy. The Gemara, Megillah 17b, says 120 elders, among whom were many prophets, wrote our Shemona Esrei. Only they could write it. Okay, so the Rav here is saying a few things. Number one, as we know and we mentioned last week, the Rav was very, very uncomfortable with any changes to accepted minhag, and especially with regards to the liturgy, as he says himself here. Okay, and not only changes, like we mentioned last week, with regards to the prayer of Nachem and the changes that Rav Goren and others tried to introduce, but Rav Soloveitchik was also uncomfortable with innovations and additions, because he felt, who are we? Who are we? We don't have the authority. We are not the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah. We are not even the Chachmei Ashkenaz, the Balei HaTosafot. Okay? And I'm skipping, but he says that these piyutim and these kinot written by Chachmei Ashkenaz, Chachmei Tzarfat, Balei HaTosafot, right? And then he writes, but Chachmei Ashkenaz and Chachmei Tzarfat were Chachmei HaMasorah. They were Chachmei HaMasorah. They were part of this chain of tradition, this unbroken chain of tradition, who had inherited the Masorah, our tradition, from the Chachmei Agmara and passed it on. They were responsible not only for piyutim, but also for the Shalshelet HaKabbalah, the transmission of the tradition as a whole. Tosafot quotes Rabbi Elazar HaKalir many times when he has a halachic problem. Now, there's a whole question as to the identity of Elazar HaKalir. Many of our piyutim, many of our kinot are authored by Elazar HaKalir. We don't exactly know who he was or when he lived, but he's quoted by the Tosafot, and you see the way they describe him. Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, many times, he was not simply a paitan, he writes, not simply a poet who composed piyutim. He was one of the Chachmei HaMasorah. So, of course, if he wrote a piyut or a kina, it has relevance. But I cannot trust others to do it. Not that I'm suspicious, not that I, God forbid, have anything against the author of a contemporary kina. I just do not believe that a contemporary has the inner ability, the faith, the depth, the sweep of experience, the ecstasy, and the tarat hanefesh, the purity of soul, that would authorize him or give him permission to write a piyut. I just do not believe that there is anyone today who is qualified to do this. And Rav Soloveitchik continues and explains that, as I mentioned before, you don't find that they composed kinot following the Chmielnitsky massacres. Okay, my rebuttal to that, if I may, Mechilat Kvodo, is that, okay, but they wrote slichot. And then he extends that to the Shoah, and he also then quotes this kina of Rabbi Klonimus ben Yehuda of Speyer, as we just saw a few moments ago, that we don't have the authority to add new days of mourning to the Jewish calendar, and together with that, Rav Soloveitchik felt we do not have the authority to add new kinot. Okay? And that Tisha B'Av is the day we mourn all of our national tragedies and calamities, and we have to use the kinot that we've inherited, so to speak. We do not have the authority. Okay? He didn't believe that there was anyone living today that could properly transmit or express the religious emotion and feeling necessary, like the Chachmei Ashkenaz, the Balei HaTosafot, the Balei HaMasorah, as he calls them. Okay, the Balei HaMasorah. And yet, we do find a genre of Holocaust kinot, many which have been included in the kinot which we recite, many which have been printed in these collections of kinot that we use. Okay, And many of them follow in the style of the established Kinot and the accepted Kinot, the Kinot that we've had for centuries. And the Kinot themselves, in a sense, if you look at them just stylistically, they often are built as extensions of the book of Eicha. Eicha, ends sort of, it's open-ended. And so then we go into these Kinot as an extension. It's one continuation. And Rav Soloveitchik had a lot to say on that too, but not for now. It's beyond our scope this morning. But how, there's certain types of things which are not permitted to say, or certain tefillot which are not permitted to say, but certain other type of tefillot are, and how there's this matir that the book of Eicha opens up and allows us to ask the question of why and how, and then the Kinot that follow over the centuries are an extension, but just stylistically, if you look at them and their form and the language, they often invoke verses from the book of Eicha, and then they continue, and there's a certain style to the Kinot. They kind of base themselves on one another, and later Kinot base themselves on previous Kinot, and so too many of these Holocaust Kinot, these contemporary Kinot, are based on that same form. You have the whole section of Kinot that begin Eli, right? Okay. Eli Tzion and others that begin Eli. So you have, similarly with the Holocaust Kinot, those that sort of take a cue and follow in that style, just like, as I said, over the centuries, the Kinot based themselves on Eicha, invoking verses and words and style and meter and rhyme, and later Kinot would follow in that same style. So some of the authors of the Holocaust Kinot would follow in that style as well. Okay, and that would seem, as I just read, to bother Rav Soloveitchik. But for instance, one which we say in my shul, in Zichron Yosef in Harnof, is a Kinah that was composed by Yehuda Leib Bialer, which begins Eli Eli, Nafshi Bechi. It was written about the Holocaust. And again, it follows in that style, as I said, of this genre of Kinot that begin with the word Eli. Okay? But you have Kinot written for the Holocaust by Rav Shimon Schwab, the head of the Breuers community. Okay? And you have Kinot written by Rav Avraham Rosenfeld. I think I called him Rosenblum last week in error. Rav Avraham Rosenfeld from London, from the UK, who published a very famous book of Kinot, and also, as I mentioned last week, made some changes to Nachem to update it, to reflect a new reality of a Jerusalem in Jewish hands, under Jewish sovereignty, a united Jerusalem. So he also wrote a Kinah, Eicha Tifartenu Meroshenu Hishlachta, and also follows in that style of typical Kinot. We say that one as well in my shul. Rav Menachem Mendel Kasher, very famous for his encyclopedic work on Midrashim, the Torah Shlema. Rav Kasher, who wasn't a survivor, he was living here in Israel, but he wrote a short Kinah about his home of Warsaw, of Warsaw, Varsha. He writes a Kinah about his city, Varsha, which was devastated, destroyed, flattened during the war, as you all know. And in fact, he intended, it's related, to publish an entire sefer with just Holocaust Kinot. He felt it was that important. And what's interesting is, while I mentioned, Rav Elvel Soloveitchik and his nephew, the Grid, Rav Yosef Dov Alevi Soloveitchik of YU, and others were against adding these Holocaust Kinot, these contemporary Kinot, you find that the Hasidim, many of whom survived the war and lost their entire Hasidim, lost their dynasty, lost their communities, and suffered so much. You find a number of Hasidic masters, a number of Rebbes composed Kinot, and among them, maybe the most famous of all those Kinot is the Kinah of the Baba Rebbe here in source number 4, where I reproduced it in its entirety. It's a short Kinah It's a beautiful Kinot. It was written by Rav Shlomo Halberstam, himself a survivor. So, of course, it's very meaningful to have a Kinot written by a survivor himself. And one of the things that I find beautiful about this particular Kinot is that, first, just the language and emotion is so beautiful. But one of the things I like about it is he doesn't try to imitate the sort of the genre of Kinot. He doesn't try to copy the style of those Kinot that we have for centuries in our collected Kinot, but he writes something very original, and we'll just look at a few of the stanzas together. Really very beautiful, very emotional, very poignant, but he writes from the heart, and it's obvious, and just the style and the emotion is something that speaks to me. And again, I like the fact that he's not taking cues from the style of previous Kinot, but it is original. There is a certain originality to it, and yet it still works. It still fits. Okay, and I think that has to do a lot with his personality, who he was. Here he was a survivor who came to the United States and rebuilt his dynasty. Babov is one of the largest Hasidic dynasties today, if not the largest. Okay. He writes, Zichru na v'konenu, Kol Yisrael, kolchem yishama berama, ki yishmida Germania et amenu, bimei za'am hamilchama, bimitot mishunot achzariot, bera'av u'v'tzama, al tishkechu b'chol hadorot, adei tisku lirot banechama. Always remember and mourn, all of Israel. Let your voices be heard on high. For Germany has destroyed our nation in the furious days of the war with cruel and unusual deaths by hunger and thirst. Do not forget for all generations until we merit consolation. Tzakatam uvchiotehem tzfufim uzgurim bakronim katson latevach huvlu lisrefa bakiv shonim kol shavam yizacher tamid lifnei shochen ma'onim bekoram shma Yisrael masur nafsham la'adonei hadonim. Their shouts and cries, screams crowded into cattle cars like sheep led to the slaughter, led to crematoria. Let the sound of their pleas forever reverberate before the one who dwells on high as they shouted Shema Yisrael and martyred themselves before the Master of Masters. Roshei Yeshivot v'talmidehem v'hamone amcha shama hevidum b'inuyim kashim v'harugum b'yad ramah demei yeladim rakim tzoakim elecha min ha'adama nekom nikmat taf v'nashim lo techayeh kol neshama. Revered teachers of yeshivot and their talmidim, their prized students, and the multitudes of the nation were enslaved, inhumanly tortured, and murdered with no compunction, no feeling. The blood of young children cries out to you from the ground. Avenge the infants and the women. Spare no soul among your enemies. And he continues, and you could read the rest on your own time and maybe even recite this on Tisha B'Av morning. It's so meaningful. And despite the opposition, for the reasons we mentioned, to the introduction of these contemporary Kinot following the Holocaust, again, many of them made their way into our collected Kinot. Many of them made their way into our minhagim, into our synagogues, into our communities, into our hearts, because they do invoke emotion, because they do touch us, maybe in a way that the traditional Kinot don't, dare I say. It's interesting, the Gemara at the very end of Masechet Tani describes how Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai would prepare for Tisha B'Av, how he would sit on the ground and eat just a dry piece of bread with some water, and he would sit between the oven and the furnace of his home. You can imagine such a dirty place back then when you had to heat a home with wood or coal. And Rashi says it was the most disgusting place in the home. And he appeared, the Gemara says, Kimisha meto mutalafanav, like someone who's deceased is there before him, which is language from the Mishnah, which describes one who just lost one of his close relatives and is in onain, in the first steps of mourning before the burial. That's how imminent the pain was. Now, how do we experience that? I mentioned last week and the week before that the challenge of Tisha B'Av is to feel a sense of loss, to access that pain. How do we access that pain? So maybe one way that we access that pain is through the Kinot, because it's so difficult for me to feel a sense of loss for a holy temple that I never saw. But if I saw the burning of the Talmud in the 13th century in France, and I read a Kinot about that, that makes me feel a sense of loss. Or it might be difficult for me to relate to the pain of the destruction of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, a temple that I never saw with my own eyes, the Churban, which I also didn't see with my own eyes. And it might even be difficult for me to relate to the pain of the 10 martyrs or the burning of the Talmud in France or the First Crusades, but I can relate to the pain of the Holocaust. That is our recent history. And so maybe that is another role of why the Kinot that we recite on Tisha B'Av morning, many of them have nothing to do with the Churban, but deal with contemporary issues. Not only because, or contemporary tragedies and other events throughout Jewish history, not only because so many things took place on Tisha B'Av, not only because Tisha B'Av is our national day of mourning when we mourn all tragedies and calamities throughout Jewish history, no matter when they took place on the calendar. Right? This is a day that's designated for mourning. But beyond that, by reading about and invoking the pain of tragic events throughout Jewish history, that's something I can relate to. And that's why, following the disengagement, or as some call it, the expulsion from Gaza or from Gush Katif, there were those individuals who composed Kinot about that as well. Now these, I don't think are recited as universally as the Holocaust Kinot, but you do have a handful of Kinot that were written following the disengagement. Here in source number 5, I just gave you a short excerpt from a Kinot of Professor Dr. Yoel Elitzur, who is a linguist, and you'll see from the really poetry here in his words in this Kinot. It's so beautifully written, so poetically written. He's a linguist. He's also an expert on the geography of Eretz Yisrael, as it is in the Tanakh. And really very, very talented individual. Also, you have Kinot written by the activist Noam Arnon, who some of you may be familiar with, along with others. But this is the one I chose to bring here for you as an example of this genre of contemporary Kinot, because this one is so beautifully written and really expresses the pain. Echa gush katif eretz ahuva gan yarak chol v'yam hava v'achva. How could it be? Again, he's drawing on this theme of Eicha. How could it be? Gush Katif, this beloved land, it's a green garden with beaches and sea, sand and sea, which is full of love and brotherhood. Maleah karimon Torah mitzvot, full of Torah and mitzvot, like a pomegranate is full of seeds. V'ata charavot v'eretz tal uvot. And this land of our desire is now destroyed. Now here, we're not going to get political, but here he addresses how the law was sort of trampled upon and made into a joke. Yishrei derech kluim ravta ha-mitzuka mishpat lemishpach utzdaka litzaka. How justice was made into. Mishpat was made lemishpach, tzedakah was made tzedakah. Justice was trampled upon, so to speak, and righteousness was transformed into wailing. So here he's taking, obviously, a jab at the government for allowing it to happen. But in any case, this Kinot expresses the real pain, and so why did those who experienced the disengagement from Gush Katif compose these Kinot, or those who witnessed it and witnessed this tragedy compose these Kinot? Because beyond just expressing the pain and grief, again, on Tisha B'Av, we mourn all sorts of tragedies and calamities, and we read these Kinot as a way to access that pain of the Churban HaBayit. And we also recognize that Jewish history is not in a vacuum. And the Churban HaBayit and the Galut, the exile, is not in a vacuum. On Tisha B'Av, we don't just mourn one aspect of our exile, but we mourn the entire scope of our exile. Our exile, our pain, our suffering, it's not in a vacuum. It's not limited to the destruction of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem alone, but rather every tragedy, Every calamity that takes place over the past 2,000 years is a direct result of that exile. Because if we wouldn't have been exiled out from Jerusalem, we wouldn't have been tortured during the Crusades, and we wouldn't have been tortured during the Spanish Inquisition and subsequently expelled from Spain. And we wouldn't have had a Holocaust. So we recognize that galut, exile, it's not in a vacuum. It's not limited just to the destruction of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. But our pain transcends time and space. And for all of those reasons, yes, we have these Kinot that have been introduced throughout the centuries. And for all of those reasons, so many of our Kinot, the overwhelming majority of our Kinot, are not dealing directly with the destruction of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Yes, they may allude to it, they may hint at it, they may refer to it, they may make comparisons, but many of them, the majority of them, are dealing with other events, other tragedies and calamities that take place throughout Jewish history. That's how we access that pain. Exile is not in a vacuum. Our pain transcends time and place. Until we, Bezrat Hashem, speedily in our days, will merit the final redemption. Okay. Thank you. Questions, comments? Yes. I know the Rebbe of Nitra, I believe, wrote a Kinah. It's possible, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the Klausenberg Rebbe wrote a Kinot. There were a number of Hasidic masters who did write Kinot. He did? Okay, so he did. There you go. There's your answer. There's your answer. You should ask her. I will refer you all my questions to you in the back. Okay, so the Klausenberg. There were a number. That one is not printed in this collection here. As I said, some of them become more popular than others, but it's interesting. The Misnagdim, if you will, the Litvish, very much against. The Litvish Apostle very much against adding Kinot. Not all of them, you see, Rav Shimon Schwab, the Yekka, but the Hasidim and the Rebbes who suffered so much, right? They were more open to composing new Kinot for the Holocaust. Okay, have a wonderful day, everyone. We'll see you Be'ezrat Hashem next Wednesday.